The French defeat of 1940 is often explained in terms of technology. The Germans had tanks and knew how to use them properly. Another often cited explanation is the strategic failure to foresee a German advance through the Ardennes. The problem of these explanations is the preponderance of hindsight, but the lack of understanding of the French experience before May 1940. If we want to understand the French strategic thinking, we have to go all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. In this war, the French amassed the main body of their army along the border with Germany in order to stage an attack into Germany, but they were well aware of the danger of a German attack through the Belgian Ardennes. Such an attack could threaten the supply lines to their army. They knew that the Belgian army would not be positioned in the Ardennes, but rather beyond the Meuse near Brussels. That's why they positioned their own reserves, the 6th Corps and the Guard Corps, to intervene in the case of an attack from the direction of the Ardennes. Unfortunately for the French, the Germans attacked through Lorraine and quickly encircled the French forces near Metz. This meant the beginning of the end for the French in 1870, who eventually lost the war against the combined German forces. The French would draw several lessons from this war. First, they would build a belt of defenses to discourage a German attack via this direction. They also positioned two of their best armies along the German border to stage an attack into Germany as soon as possible. But again, they were aware that the Germans would probably try to attack via the Belgian Ardennes this time to avoid running into the French belt of fortresses along their common border. For these reasons, they deployed no less than 3 armies to blunt such an attack. The Germans were indeed putting their main force of 4 armies along the Belgian border to attack from that direction. Their main thrust would however not attack via the Ardennes, but via Liège and through the corridor between Brussels and Namur. This meant that the French counterattack in the Ardennes was futile, and that the Fifth Army, together with the British Expeditionary Force, had to be diverted to prevent the outflanking of the French in the Ardennes. All of these Allied efforts were in vain, and the Germans advanced until the Marne, where the attack was finally stopped in its tracks by a vigorous counterattack. The French learned from the previous 2 conflicts with Germany. First, they fortified their common border with Germany. Secondly, they put the bulk of their forces along the Belgian frontier to blunt the main German thrust via Brussels. Meanwhile, the Belgian army expected the main German attack coming in from the Netherlands to outflank the Belgian fortress cities of Liège and Namur at the Meuse River. They dug a canal, which also served as an anti-tank barrier, and positioned their main force along this canal. Both neutral Belgium and the Allies believed that the German main thrust would have to pass between Antwerp and Namur, whether coming in directly from the east or as a detour from the north. The French were confident that the Germans would once again direct their main thrust between Brussels and Namur and strengthened their best army with the Cavalry Corps, a fully motorized army corps with hundreds of tanks, to prepare for a clash in that sector. The Germans would attack the Netherlands and Belgium as many expected, and with the deployment of their paratroopers near Liège, it seemed that their main thrust would come from that direction. This presumption, strengthened by the deployment of an armored army corps in that sector, gave the Allies the impression that this was the main German attack. The clash between the French cavalry corps and the German armored corps did occur, but the main body of German armor was concentrated in an army-sized unit called Armored Force Kleist. Armored Force Kleist advanced through the Ardennes, and while the French believed to have fought the main German force near Brussels, Armored Force Kleist arrived at the Meuse. This was the move which the French anticipated in 1870 and 1914, but no longer in 1940. In 1940, there were no more French reserves to counter a possible German breakout from the Ardennes, and this is exactly what happened when Armored Force Kleist broke out in the middle of May 1940 and encircled the main Allied forces in Belgium. As a result, these forces were beaten and the British had to evacuate from Dunkirk. In hindsight, the weak defense of the Ardennes in 1940 was a mistake, but knowing the history of the previous campaigns of 1870 and 1914, the French were no longer expecting a German attack from the Ardennes, for which they had prepared in 1870 and 1914. They were expecting that the Germans would once again try to outflank the French forces via an attack on the Belgian flatlands north of the Meuse. The Germans, in their turn, gambled that the French would commit their main forces north of the Meuse in order to enable them to overrun the second-class French forces in the Ardennes. They tried to convince the French that they would attack north of the Meuse by making a spectacle of the Meuse crossing near Liège with paratroopers and tanks. The German ruse paid off and they won the campaign by anticipating French moves rather than any superiority of numbers or weapons, which on the whole they didn't have.